Okay, welcome everyone. We are going to continue with our discussions about Eretz Israel. We began with talking about time and space, and then we took those ideas and began to apply them to the land of Israel. I believe this is our third in the series. There will be one more next week about Eretz Israel, and then we will move on to another subject in our series, Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. So here we're going to start with the beginning of the Torah. The very first Rashi is an incredibly significant commentary. And the first thing he says on the first verse of the Torah is, he quotes his teacher, who asked, why does the Torah begin from Bereshit and not from Chodesh Hazeh Lachem? This month is the first of the months. So obviously his question is rhetorical, because the Torah does begin from Bereshit. So what is he trying to get to? Chodesh Hazeh Lachem, this is the mitzvah that was given. It's considered the first mitzvah given to the entire Jewish people, and it was given in preparation for us to leave Egypt. And Chodesh Hazeh Lachem, this is the first of the months of the year for you. And with that, God gave over to Moshe all of the instructions and secrets of the Jewish calendar, which begins from the month of Nisan, Chodesh Hazeh Lachem. So the question is, isn't the Torah a book of law? Torah comes from the word hora'ah, which means instruction. So why is the Torah beginning from the creation of the world? Isn't its purpose to give instruction of how to live on a daily level? That's the concept behind the question. But of course, it does start with Bereshit. So Rashi continues and says, so why does it start from Bereshit? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So he brings a verse that says, Koach ma'asav higid la'amo, letet lehem nachala b'goyim. The verse says, the power of his deeds, he told his people, in order to give them an inheritance among the nations. So what does this mean? Koach ma'asav, the power of his deeds. There's a beautiful hint here. The word koach, the power of his deeds, koach equals 28. And there are exactly 28 letters in the first verse of the Torah. Remember, Rashi is trying to show, why does the Torah begin from the first verse? So the power of his deeds, he told his people. In other words, the Torah begins from Bereshit because God needed to tell the story of creation to his people. Why? And this is why I'm bringing this. In order to give them an inheritance among the nations. So Rashi continues. This commentary is about 1,000 years old. It is so relevant for today. He said, because in the future, the nations of the world will come and say, listimatem, you are thieves, you're robbers, you stole Eretz Israel. Who gave you the right to Eretz Israel? So what are we going to answer? So Rashi says that's why the Torah has to start from Bereshit. And he continues by saying, because the same God who created heavens and earth, he's the one who gave us Eretz Israel. That is our claim to Eretz Israel. In the Torah, God gives us the land. But if you don't believe in God and you don't believe that God created the world, so what good is that argument? But Rashi is assuming that this argument will carry weight. Now, if you go to the United Nations and you make this claim, not sure how far you get. We're doing better than we were like 10, 15 years ago. 10, 15 years ago, most votes went like 170 to 3. Israel, United States, and Micronesia. Micronesia always used to vote with Israel. It's a little bit different now, but you hear the prophetic insight that Rashi had to say this. So I'm bringing this, the first part of this class, because what we're going to be looking into is the connection between creation and the land of Israel. Now, according to a number of midrashim, Eretz Israel is the center of the world. In the Holy of Holies, and it's actually still under the mosque, there is a stone called the foundation stone, Even Hashtiyah. It's called the foundation stone. The Holy of Holies was situated on this stone, and the whole temple was surrounded, really, this stone. And according to various midrashim, which we're not going to go into now, but there is this concept that from this stone, that is the center of the world. From that stone, and one midrash calls it like the navel of the world. Just like a fetus in the mother's womb is, in a sense, the center of the baby, that the lifeline of the baby is the umbilical cord. And so this Even Shti'ah is called like the center of the world, just like the embryo gets its sustenance. And so one of the midrashim explain that the center of the world is this foundation stone. This foundation stone is the center of the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is the center of the temple. The temple is the center of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the center of Israel. And Israel is the center of the world. It's a very, very beautiful midrash. And the truth is that in all ancient maps, they used to put Jerusalem in the middle, because it lies literally in the middle of the 3 major continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Okay, you have North and South America, you have Australia, but as far as in a sense, a continuous land mass, Europe and Asia kind of meld together as a land mass. And maybe the Suez Canal separates, but Africa and Asia are also, in a sense, one land mass. And Jerusalem's right in the middle. That's why throughout all the generations, everyone wanted to control the land of Israel for economic purposes, for the trade routes, and then later, of course, spiritually, where it becomes the center of the 3 major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So all of this, in a sense, is alluded to in this Rashi, where he explains that the Torah begins from Bereshit, because in the future we would need this in order to make our claim to the land of Israel. So we see that there's this deep connection between creation and the land of Israel. So in one of the next Rashis on the word Bereshit, so usually we translate the bet, Bereshit, as in the beginning. Reshit is beginning. Ba is in the. But Rashi says that you can also understand ba means bishvil. We also start with a bet, for the sake of. And Rashi says, for the sake of Torah, which is called the first, and for the sake of Israel, which is called the first. But with Israel, the verse that is quoted is Reshit Tevuata, the first of God's grains, his harvest. So this also alludes to the land, that the people and the land in this verse are obviously connected. So here again, we have this connection that for the sake of Israel, God created the world. And we have another midrash that says, when God first thought of creating the world, Yisrael Allah b'machshava techila. The thought of Israel arose first in God's mind. Now, this is talking about the people of Israel, but the people in the land, as we've learned, are totally bonded together in a covenant. So when you talk about the people of Israel, you're also talking about the land of Israel. Okay, now we're going to introduce a new idea, and we're going to spend a good part of the class on this idea, and that is the mitzvah of the first fruits. In the Torah, in Parsha Ki Tavo, in the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, there is a mitzvah of bringing one's first fruits of the fruits of Eretz Yisrael, not of the main fruits of Eretz Yisrael. There's 7 main fruits. And this mitzvah was to take, a person would take a symbolic fruit of their entire harvest. They could have hundreds of acres or dunams of a orchard, and they would bring up, quite literally, the first fruit, and they would bring it to the temple, and it was a tremendous procession with music, and everyone came out from Jerusalem and greeted the people coming up in this procession, and then they would come to the temple, and they decorated these baskets with the first fruits, and then they made a speech called the vidui, which means, in a sense, a confession, but not in like a negative way. It means more of a speech of acknowledgement and thanksgiving. So the midrash in Breshit Rabbah says an amazing thing. It says, for the sake of the mitzvah of Bikurim, God created the world. So there's a big question there. For one mitzvah, for a mitzvah that we can't even keep today, we don't have a temple. So even when there was a temple, how do we understand that for the mitzvah of Bikurim, of the first fruits, God created the world? So the first hint is in the Torah. It says, take mireshit, from the first of your fruits. We call the mitzvah Bikurim when the fruits become ripe, and they're the first of the fruits, the choicest of the fruits. But Mereshit means literally from the first of the fruits. Well, that's just like Bereshit. Here it says Mireshit. So already there's a very deep connection, that the language that's used for this mitzvah is the same as in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So to understand this, we bring a beautiful teaching. Some of you probably have heard this before. It's from the introduction to the Zohar. And in it, there's there's a number of children's books that have been created with beautiful graphics and pictures based on this Zohar. And in this teaching, it says that the letters of the Torah came before God and wanted the Torah to begin from them. So interestingly enough, it begins from the last letter. The last letter, Tav, comes before God and says, you should start the Torah with me, because the first letter of the Torah is a Tav. So you should start with me. And I don't remember exactly, but for each letter, God said that very good thought, but, and he would bring a verse or a word that also began with that letter that wasn't so positive. So God said, no, I can't begin the Torah with you. And like the next one, if I remember correctly, is the Shin. And the Shin says, well, one of the names of God begins with me, the name Shin Daled Yud, Shakai. So you should begin the Torah with me. So God said that's very nice, but the word for untruth, sheker, begins with you also. So I can't start the Torah with you. So it goes to all the letters until it gets to the bet. And the bet says, my letter begins the word bracha, blessing. And with this word, we will bless you. We will acknowledge you. We will praise you. We say 100 brachas today, Baruch, from the language of blessing. So God, it sounds very superficial, but God said, I like that idea. I like the idea that everyone is going to bless me. And so the Torah began with a bet. So let's look at the speech that a person who brings up the first fruits says. Okay, so again, this is in Parshat Kitavo. It's Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 3 through 10. So it says like this. I'll try to read it fairly quickly. You shall come to whomever will be the Kohen, the priest in those days, and you shall say to him, I declare today to God that I have come to the land that God swore to our forefathers to give us. The Kohen, the priest, shall take the basket from your hand and lay it before the altar of God. Then you shall call out and say before God, your God. And this is the speech that a person would say. An Aramean tried to destroy my forefather. He descended to Egypt and sojourned there. This is talking about Jacob, that Lavan tried to destroy Jacob. And Jacob descended to Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, strong, and numerous. The Egyptians mistreated us and afflicted us and placed hard work upon us. Then we cried out to God, the God of our forefathers, and God heard our voice and saw our affliction and travail and our oppression. God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm, with great awesomeness and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now, behold, I brought the first fruits of the ground that you have given me, O God. And that's where it stops. And then it says, and you shall lay it before God, your God, and you shall prostrate yourself before God, your God. So in the Mishnah, they describe this whole procession and process of people coming up to Jerusalem as a very, very joyous time. And even though the speech sounded somewhat serious, it's given in complete and total state of joy. And so now we can understand a little bit what it means that for the sake of this mitzvah, God created the world. Because here it's talking about that when we received the Torah in Sinai, so it was clear from the very beginning that this wasn't the end of the story. See, if Israel would have been, let's say, a religion, so that would be everything. We receive the Torah from God and we go about our business. But the whole idea of receiving the Torah in Sinai was to bring it into the land of Israel and create a living society that would put into practice the laws of the Torah and to be a light unto the nations. That was the purpose. In other words, coming into Eretz Yisrael was the end purpose. And of course, setting up a righteous society that would fulfill the Torah. So here in this speech, the person's kind of goes to all of history but ends up with, and you gave us a land flowing with milk and honey, and here I am bringing my first fruits. My cup runneth over. I'm overjoyed, and what greater thing can I do than to bring this offering to the temple? So this tells us a little bit about what this midrash means, that for the sake of the mitzvah of Bikurim, God created the world. So we want to go a little bit deeper here, because there's another very, very important Rashi on the actually, for those who were here on Sunday, we learned this week on Sunday about the Kiddush that we make Friday night. We begin Yom HaShishi Vayachulu Hashmayim V'Aretz V'Chol Tzva'am. And on the sixth day, when God created the heavens and the earth and all of their host. And so it says Yom HaShishi, the sixth day. So Rashi points out, it doesn't say that about any of the other days. It doesn't say it was evening and it was morning, the second day. It was evening and morning, the third day. It says it was evening and morning. Yom, see, in English, it's different in Hebrew. In Hebrew, there's a hey, ha-shishi, the sixth day. But the other days, it just says second day, third day. It doesn't say the second day, the third, even though like in most translations, it will have the second day. But that's not what it says in the Hebrew. So Rashi asks, why on the sixth day? So he says, this is the sixth day is alluding to another sixth day. And that is the 6th of Sivan. That is the day that the Torah was given. That's the day that we celebrate Shavuos every year. And so Rashi continues by saying an amazing thing. We learn from this that if we would not have received the Torah at Sinai, God would have returned the world to tohu vavohu, chaos and void. And Rashi says that the whole world was on condition that we would receive the Torah at Sinai. In other words, without a moral and ethical foundation to the world, there would be no purpose to the world. There would be no purpose to the natural world. So this is connecting the Torah and Israel to creation. Remember the first Rashi that we quoted, where Rashi brings, for the sake of the Torah, which is called the first of his way, and for the sake of Israel, which is called the first of his produce, God created the world. And then we have the Midrash, for the sake of the mitzvah of Kurim, God created the world. So here we're connecting creation, Torah, and Israel from the very beginning to today. So we see, again, going to the Rashi, that the Torah begins from the story of creation in order for us to be able to say to the nations, the same God who created heavens and earth, he gave us the land. That is our deed to Eretz Yisrael. So here we see a beautiful connection between the Torah, Israel, creation, and Eretz Yisrael. And in fact, just one more connection is that I mentioned before, where it says, for the power of his deeds, he told his people, in order to give them an inheritance among the nations. And we said that the first verse in the Torah has 28 letters, which is koach, the power of his deeds. It has 7 words and 28 letters. So it's pointed out that the verse that introduces the 10 commandments also has 7 words and 28 letters. V'yadaber Elokim et kol hadavarim ha'ela le'mor. And God said all of these things, saying, and then the 10 commandments begin. And so they make this connection between creation and this Rashi that said that had we not received the Torah at Sinai, the whole world would have returned to chaos and void. And even further, as we're going to see in a second, an amazing scientific concept, the world wouldn't have been created in the first place. Not only that it would have been returned to chaos and void, but it wouldn't have been created in the first place. So Rashi also explains on the Mishnah, how did they do the first fruits? So I'm not going to go through the whole procession, but it was very joyous. And people decorated their oxen and they decorated their baskets and they played music and they came up together. People came up together, not individually. Came up like a whole march, a whole procession, and all the people of Jerusalem would come out and greet them and accompany them to the temple. It was just, the description is absolutely just beautiful, very inspirational. So Rashi says, though, but how did we take the first fruits? So he says, Adam Yarad L'Sadah. A person went down to his field and he saw a fruit and he picked one fruit. Again, someone could have hundreds, thousands of acres of an orchard, but the person is going to choose one fruit, and they would tie it's called in Hebrew, gumi. In modern Hebrew, gumi is a rubber band. They would tie some kind of a thread or material around this first fruit, and that was designated among all the fruits. That was the first fruit. So for those who remember, I'll review it very, very quickly. When we first began discussing the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, so we said that the word in Hebrew for holy, kadosh, is connected to the verb form hekdesh, which means separated, chosen, designated for a certain purpose. That's how something becomes holy. And if you remember, we saw how all the concepts that we consider holy is because God chose them to be holy. And we went through Abraham, Lashon HaKodesh, Hebrew, Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, Jerusalem. We went through Eretz Yisrael, Eretz HaKodesh, Shabbos Kodesh. All of these things, it was God who chose and separated these things to be special and holy. So, but here we see with the first fruits, the same thing is happening. This fruit becomes holy because it was designated of all the possible fruits. There could have been thousands of fruits, but the person like kind of lays his eye on one fruit and ties a thread around it, and that becomes the first fruits. So here I want to take this idea and connect it to modern physics and in quantum physics. And we'll see an incredible connection here, an amazing connection. When I went to school, I don't know how many people out there could go back that far, but when we learned science, we learned about the atom, and all we learned about was there was a nucleus, and there was a proton, a neutron, and an electron. That's what they knew about the atom. And the form, Malka is saying me as well. So now, if you would go to a high school or a college textbook about an atom, you'd have scores of particles in every atom. They've discovered scores and scores of particles. The big change came recently, like I said, I don't know, the last 20, 30 years. We were taught that the proton, the neutron, and the electron were entities. They were specific particles of matter. Now they don't talk about that so much. It's more, they are, this went out of my head. Give me a second. Someone help me here. No, not potential. They are, I can't believe it. I went blank here. Not possibility. They are, it'll come to me. It's energy. In other words, they're waves. They're, I can't believe this is a senior moment here. This is totally a senior moment. Oh, you know what? Give me a second. I'm going to find it. One second. Give me a second. Wave functions. That's it. Wave functions. Well, what is a wave function? A wave function means, in theory, that the electron can be anywhere. Can be anywhere. And this is one of the basics of quantum physics, is back almost 100 years when quantum physics realized that you could not measure accurately both the position and the velocity of particles in an atom. That it was an impossibility to be able to get them both totally accurate, the velocity and the position. And this opened up the whole idea of quantum physics. And today it's led to science is talking more that the physical world that we see, even though it certainly appears to us to be entities, a table is an entity. And right, the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty is they couldn't do both. And so, excuse me. And so the world appears to be solid entities. Okay, now we know everything is energy. Everything is energy, but they've gone far beyond that. And all of energy is now being called encoded information. It's like, it's so ethereal that the way we understand it is, we say this every morning, Kulam b'chachma asita. God, you made everything in wisdom. In other words, the wisdom is the thought behind the energy, behind the matter. And that's what science is coming to. Science is coming to that everything is manifestations of information. Just like we talk about the DNA. The DNA is real. It's like we think of it as an entity, but this entity is basically encoded information that gets translated into living beings. In other words, the information on the DNA is what makes you and me who we are. It's the pure information encoded. So I want to take this back to two ideas that is going to connect to this idea that for the sake of this mitzvah, God created the world, or the thought of Israel arose first, or the idea for the sake of the Torah and for the sake of Israel, God created the world before God created the world. So here, there's another idea in science, which is just mind-blowing. So what they say now, and they've done thousands of experiments, well, how do you know where an electron is? If in theory it can be anywhere in potential, how do we even record it altogether? And so they say is when an observer observes particles, and the language that science uses today, it forces the electron to take a position. Now it's counterintuitive, it's mystical. The concept is absolutely, Malka says, right, it collapses the wave function for the electron is now can be seen or recorded or manifest in a particular point. So now let's go back to the person who goes out to their field and sees thousands of figs on the tree. Any one of them could be Kurim. Any one of them could be the first fruits. But what happens at a certain point, the person chooses one of them, and that becomes Bikurim. That becomes the first fruit. So there's a deep parallel here, a deep parallel. Now we're going to go one step beyond. And this is, it's a concept. It can't be proven at this point. But John Wheeler is considered one of the greatest physicists of the last 50 years. He took this concept of consciousness. For those who have been attending classes, we've talked about this many, many, many times. The concept in Sefer Yetzirah that there's world, there's space, time, and soul. The language in Sefer Yetzirah is olam, world, shana, year, and nefesh, soul. Translated means space, time, and soul. And we said that until Einstein, space and time were considered two, like apples and oranges. It had no, what's the connection really? He was able to show that they are totally unified, enmeshed, one in the other. And now science is coming to this idea that consciousness not just affects reality, but in a great measure determines reality. And that's this whole, it's a mystical concept that only when an electron is observed does the wave function collapse, and it takes a specific position. So this is so John Wheeler says like this. He said that if consciousness would not have developed in creation, there could not have been creation at all. This is almost exactly what Rashi says, that if the Jewish people don't receive the Torah at Sinai, God would return the world to tohu and vohu. In other words, if there wouldn't be purpose, there wouldn't be a moral, ethical purpose to the world, it would collapse. John Wheeler goes one step before it. It wouldn't have been created. It could not have been created had there not been built into the creative process that at some point there would be consciousness, because if not, everything would remain tohu vavohu. Everything would remain tohu vavohu. So David just put on the chat that also the scientists Wigner and I missed that last name, sorry, also say the same thing. So this is very, very connected to this idea of how Bikurim are chosen. But now if we translate that to our own lives, this is, everyone has heard this, a famous statement from the Baal Shem Tov, who said, think good and it will be good. Because so many times, and we all struggle with this, so many times we conceive of life as, in a sense, happening to us. In an extreme case, we think of ourselves as victims. But just in like a passive sense, it's like there's so much happening, like it's happening to us. And sometimes we forget that we actually can influence what's happening to us. So the Baal Shem said, think good and it will be good. And that's the same thing, that reality is infinite potential, infinite possibilities. So how do we narrow down like some kind of a focus for our life? Through consciousness. If not, we're kind of like sleepwalking through life. It's happening to us, not that we can determine what our lives will be like. And we know that we can't determine everything. There's no claim to that. That would be extreme to think that we can totally control everything that happens to us and around us. It isn't that simple. But in great measure, we can determine how we react to things, what our attitude is to things. That we can act. We can act upon. So putting this all together, so we see many, many very deep connections here between the creative process creation, purpose, Torah, and Israel, between the land of Israel as the place, the space where this moral, ethical purpose upon which the entire world is really based. Like we saw before, that Israel is like the navel of the world. And last week, for those who remember, we talked about the Temple Mount being a vortex of energy. And so I'll just repeat again, because it's such a beautiful visualization that in the middle of the Holy of Holies, what it sits on is called the foundation stone. And the Holy of Holies is in the middle of the temple. The temple is the middle of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the middle of Israel. And Israel is the middle of the world. So this is what we'll call spiritual geography. This is in a physical sense, because throughout history, Israel was in the middle of the world. It just because of its location. And then because of oil and the politics, Israel remains in the middle of the world. And now, because of technology, Israel is slowly, not even so slowly, it is turning in to the technical capital of the world. The incubator of so many ideas. I'm sure some people have seen, it's been on Facebook many, many times, people who are into BDS. And so the answer is, okay, that's okay, but that means you have to stop using like this and this and this and this, because they were all developed in Israel, and they're all over the world now. The startup nation. Yes, someone just chatted, the startup nation. So, but here we're dealing both spiritually and physically, geographically, with Israel being the center of the world. And along with that comes a lot of responsibility. It is true, but along with that comes a lot of responsibility for bringing light and healing and rectification and peace and love to the world. That's why we're in the middle of the world, because we have this function, this mission to fulfill. Okay, so we'll end with a bracha. And the bracha is that really through our consciousness, to a great degree, we can choose our attitude about life. Again, we can't control everything that happens to us, let alone the whole world. But we can, to a great measure, control what we say and what we do, and how we want to live, and what our attitude is. So we all should choose good, and we should strengthen our connection to the Torah of Israel, the God of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel.